I just want to read. Is it recording now?
Yes, it said it was.
Okay, it is. You know, something has changed. Every time I used to record, it would have this like Siri voice, and it would say recording in progress now, and it's not doing that anymore. And I don't even see the little. Well, I think it's because I have on screen share that's why it's not showing up. Anyway, what was I saying? Um, I want to just read a couple passages of Tim Parks that I think are really enlightening in terms of getting at the specific issues that he's concerned with, and particularly really illustrating them and exemplifying them. There's this great passage about this book by a book. Is it Philip Green? I can't even remember. But well, he gives a little excerpt from a book and asks you like, what the heck is actually going on? And he says that his students, when they read this passage, they have no clue what's being discussed because it's not quite that it goes over their heads, like they can't understand it. It's like we have a tendency a lot of times, reading consists of scanning the words and reciting them. But a lot of times we don't go through the process of really digesting the meaning of the words we have scanned. Now, I provided some content, PowerPoints and videos dealing with reading and interpretation that we really haven't had time to touch on in class, and we won't directly. And they are also going to be the subject of another little quiz, same kind of multiple choice quiz, sometime in the near future. And I will clarify that soon. But one of the basic issues of this class that is our goal, reading consists of three interconnected things. Reading consists of scanning words on the page. Then when you scan them, you're reciting those words either aloud or silently in your head. And then the third part of reading is the process of digesting what has been said and interpreting it and understanding it, translating it into your own words or reading between the lines and discovering that what is actually being said is more than just what's on the page. This is one of the great revelations about reading, that authors say more than simply what's on the page, and the text, the black and white text that's on the page points to a fuller, more robust meaning or fuller implications that have actually remained unsaid. And that the function of reading ultimately is the process of making inferences. And making inferences means drawing conclusions from the text that the text really points to. And one of the examples I give is this little vignette about Winston Churchill with this woman. And she says, Mr. Churchill, you're drunk. And Mr. Churchill responds, in the morning, I'll be sober and you'll still be what is he? He says, Madam, you're ugly, and in the morning I'll be sober. And the inference to be drawn is the answer to one of the quiz questions, which I'm not going to say. But the point is, what he's really telling her is actually unsaid. And what he's really telling her is actually, quote unquote, said in the mind of his own listener. And the listener here is analogous or parallel to the reader. The real meat and potatoes of any text, it starts with what's on the page. There's no doubt about that. An author says one thing rather than another thing. They say it this way rather than that way. They're not saying it your way. They're saying it their way, and they're saying what they want to say. So the text creates fixed parameters of what you can actually find in it. There's certain things many students will say, oh, interpretation is subjective. There is an important element of interpretation that is, quote unquote, subjective. One of the questions is, what the hell does that mean? What does it mean that interpretation is subjective? The problem is the text is like a playing field with certain boundaries, and it sets up certain rules, and it's playing a certain game, right? If the text is playing basketball, you can't play tennis with it. It just doesn't work that way, right? The title of Mending Wall is not Two Guys Fix a Wall. The title is Mending Wall. It's a very specific title, and the text itself creates parameters around really what that can mean. And what I'm arguing here is that in the broad sense, there are certain meanings from a text that are absolutely kind of ironclad and objective, which is to say they are simply the product of the logic set up in the text, and they're there for you to draw out the conclusions. For example, if someone gives you an equation, 2 + 2 = blank, there's only one real answer to that equation. It naturally follows that the answer is blah, blah, blah. And it's not blah, blah, blah. It's only one thing. And there is certainly a vital role to be played by one's own personal experience. There's a vital role to be played just, you know, the way you think rather than another person thinks, right? But in terms of what I'm concerned with in this class, in terms of our interpretations, and this will be an issue like when we get to the midterm and the final, right? I don't need you to follow everything about my quote unquote interpretation. If you can make an argument for an interpretation that's consistent with the text, that the text does not contradict, then you have the workings of a valid interpretation. Now, what I try and how I try to present books to students, I try to be as faithful as I can to the book itself. I do have kind of certain interests, but my interests kind of tend to align with the interests of the books themselves. I mean, maybe that's partly the reason I teach them, because I'm simpatico, I'm sympathetic, or at least I'm trying to be sympathetic with the kind of natural meanings found in these books. And I try to give you guys a blueprint for opening them up, and a blueprint that opens up other possibilities of meaning rather than trying to direct you all in a very specific and narrow way, right? So on and so forth. Okay. So let me just say a few things. I feel like I'm backtracking a little bit here, but I really want to hammer these things home, because these have to do with really the way we're going to approach books, how we're going to understand what these books really are, what their purpose is. Why should we give a hoot about them? Why should we care? I know these books are important to human beings, but I do feel obliged to provide like a justification to you as students as to why we're reading them and why they might actually be important, instead of just saying they're important because they're important, like kind of tautological. So what are our goals here? To appreciate great books, which represent the accumulated wisdom of the ages. And I'll come back to this concept when we look at what a great book is. I believe that these books present truth in the form of fiction or myth or story, right? From the vocabulary, mythos is a narrative account. A narrative, what is a narrative? You tell me, what is a narrative? It's not a terribly fancy thing. It's just an important thing. What's a narrative?
It's a story.
Yeah, it's a story. Because we are the speaking animal, unlike all other animals, nobody communicates, no other animal communicates the way we do, with symbolic thinking and storytelling. Because we're the speaking animal, we also happen to be the storytelling animal. A myth is a narrative account. Who remembers what is intended by the concept of an account? I'm not talking about a bank account here, but the word is related to that in a general way. What do I mean by a narrative? Yeah, so a narrative is just a story. What's a narrative account? It's a certain type of story. It has a certain purpose that's really important. And for Genesis, this is really crucial. And probably you're not used to hearing the word account used in this way, but once you hear it, you'll recognize it.
Is it like a meaningful story?
It is meaningful, but it's meaningful in a certain way.
Oh.
is it told in events, like people's perspective?
Yeah, so you're picking up on some of the vocabulary. I mean, well, yes, but I don't, that doesn't get to the issue of what a narrative account is. The Bible is a story. It's a narrative account. The Odyssey is a story. It's a myth. It's a narrative account. Think about if I say to you, I know nobody speaks this way, but you do something and someone says, some authority figure says, account for yourself. Give an accounting of what you did today.
It's like kind of describing stuff in detail, correct? Like your bank account itemizes
You're
your
getting
transactions.
closer. You're getting closer.
Is it not about series of events?
It's gonna be. It's gonna be. I mean, most myths deal with like certain core themes of the human experience, right? Things that all civilizations have encountered and struggled with. Each society, each civilization, each moment in history, you could say, deals with, they have a different solution to the problem. Maybe they understand the problem slightly differently, right? So we kind of want to recognize both identity and difference from one culture to the next, that they see some of the same things, but maybe from a slightly different perspective. And then they have different solutions, different ways to skin the cat about how to deal with those kind of core challenges of human existence. An account for yourself. Nobody, I'm going to ask any other.
It's like describing
But it's a specific type of description.
a situation.
It's not so much about, look, myth is about what is described. Like, for example, a creation myth deals with origins. But it's not so much about what's described, but about the purpose of the story, the purpose of the story. And yes, Vicky, by definition, myth comes under the category of fiction, right? Okay. Nobody, because we want to move forward here. When I use the word account here, a narrative account, a mythos is a narrative account, a fictional account. When I use the word count, I mean an explanation of something. When you typically think of a story, you think of it, it's just about a person or people. It's about a situation. There's a conflict, things go forward, things change. There's a resolution to the conflict, however perfect or imperfect, right? We don't always think of stories as explanations for why things are the way they are, right? But particularly a myth, especially in its more like it's more specific, rigorous sense of like creation myths like Genesis, or myths of Hesiod and Homer, the Greek poets, right? A myth is a narrative explanation of something, right? There are phenomena of the world we're trying to understand with our minds to make sense of our experiences. And what do we do to make sense of the world as human beings? We tell stories. We tell stories which explain why things are the way they are. Now, this is really crucial on two factors. Number one, what is the human discipline today that we credit with explaining the world to us? What's the primary thing you'd think of?
Science.
Yes, thank you. Today, because we are modern people living in the aftermath of the scientific revolution in the 17th century, more or less, and then the Enlightenment in the 18th century, science has become the one kind of universally agreed upon human discipline of inquiry to accurately understand the world around us, because it has the method and it's quantitative and it only measures certain things and it's rigorous or objective in a way that we are more skeptical of human speech and books and things of that sort, and certainly things like religious books that seem to describe things that science can't see or understand or recognize at all, right? But let's be clear, before there was science, well, actually, before there was science, there was philosophy. Philosophy was attempting to give scientific explanations of the world, but instead of doing experiments and using numbers, philosophers, let's just say, observed the world of their experiences and tried to articulate their experiences and the truth of them in speech, in natural language, as opposed to mathematics, right? Galileo, one of the great founders of modern natural science, right? He said, the book of the world is written in numbers or in number. He said for him, when he looked at the world, the truth of it was going to be found in numerical relationships and quantities, right? And everything could be measured, right? And that's what science does. It looks at the world quantitatively and it tries to measure everything and establish relationships and understand, establish laws of cause and effect and so on and so forth. But before there was science and before there was philosophy, there were stories, there were myths, and these myths were the primary mode by which people explained the phenomena of the world to themselves, right? And instead of talking about a force of gravity or whatever scientific thing you might discuss, they said there were gods that caused things to happen to people or to a nation of people who worshiped certain gods or didn't worship correctly certain gods and so on. So it's really important, myth is not about, it should be entertaining. I mean, any person who's ever written a story and actually wants to tell it to other people, like the story has to be engaging, it has to be enthralling, it has to provoke your mind and heart. But the function of these stories is not simply to be cute or the childhood of mankind or simply to entertain. The goal is to explain to people the world around them. And why? Because we need lots of explanation to function in the world, number one. And number two, we're profoundly curious about the world. Aristotle says in his Metaphysics, says, mankind, human beings have the power to know. They have understanding, they have reason. And because they have the power to know, they desire to understand things, which is just another way of saying, because we have the ability to understand things, it makes us curious to use our power of understanding to make sense of the world. And of course, there's lots of reasons why we feel deep needs to make sense of our own experiences. And we all spend, I think, every day of our lives, conscious lives, when we have language working, we're constantly generating a narrative in our own heads to explain what is happening to us and what is going on around us, right? It's something we do. It's part of, I would even argue it's part of our survival instinct. And it's definitely connected in with a kind of evolutionary adaptation, which starts with the ability to speak and have symbolic thinking. Okay, so there's something really interesting here, which is that I'm making a funny argument that truth can be presented in the form of fiction, right? Truth can be presented in the form of fiction. Picasso has this great book. I take it everybody knows who Pablo Picasso is.
Yes.
I mean, I suppose that's like a duh, but I don't know anymore. It should be a duh, even if you don't know his work that well, you should know his name. So he has a great little book. There's a great little book of quotations by Picasso about art and life and all kinds of different stuff. And in it, he's quoted as saying, art is a lie that gets at the truth. Art is a lie that gets at the truth. He was a painter, so most of what he did was painting. He did some other stuff too, but we can ignore that. A painting, let's say, of his mistress is not actually his mistress. Duh, it's a flat surface with paint on it. So in a sense, it's a representation of his mistress. It's a lie. It's not the real thing. That's what so he's being a little flamboyant when he says lie. We would just say it's a representation of the world rather than reality itself. But he says art is a lie that gets at the truth. So this kind of fictional world of painting, images, pictures, or novels, or myths, or stories, while they're not literally true, have ways of getting at the truth of our own experiences. And we'll come back to that issue in just a moment. I'm going to kind of speed up. So one thing we're going to learn is a little bit of history. Next week, when we start tackling Genesis, we're going to get a little background about the world of the agricultural revolution in ancient Mesopotamia. That's the region of the Fertile Crescent. That's ancient Iraq, right? That's where, you know, we went to war and did all those wonderful things. We liberated the Iraqis and gave them democracy, right? That's the ancient Mesopotamia. And most of the famous ancient Mesopotamian city-states from which a substantial portion of world culture originated, right, are in modern day Iraq. And of course, the Bible and the whole biblical tradition, Old Testament and New, comes from ancient Mesopotamia, really, in the extended area, right? And this is the cradle of civilization, not just for the Middle East. This is the cradle of civilization for the world, right? A direct line connection from ancient Mesopotamia through to the modern world. So we're going to learn some historical background to give us a point of reference on understanding these texts, because they make references to things, they speak in a way, they refer to traditions and habits that you're not going to be familiar with because you're a modern American living in the 21st century. You're not a farmer living in the period of the agricultural revolution in ancient Mesopotamia. Okay, to see how these texts reveal perennial elements and conflicts of the human condition and human nature, right? Perennial, meaning like permanent and fixed and like timeless. Human nature, what do I mean? What the human being is really like at base. What kind of, particularly psychologically, in terms of their needs and their desires and the different types of things that motivate human beings to act, right? Human condition just means the kind of situation we're thrown in, right? Culturally, economically, religiously, what have you, right? Human nature is always tethered to a situation, a circumstance that it's in. And one of the interesting things about human nature is just how malleable, how changeable it really is. And as human beings operate in different conditions, their nature, to some degree, it has some latitude to adjust to those conditions and change. Next thing, and this is something we see in Houellebecq quite well, but also Machiavelli's letter to Vittori, to engage personally with the characters and their situations and consider own personal reactions, subjective and objective, to the characters and their actions and the challenges and dilemmas that they face, right? You know, what Harold Bloom says, you've got to read what comes close to you, right? What seems relevant to you, what you connect with. Well, one of the ways that you make things relevant to you is to read with a sense of, you know, a personal engagement with the story, a personal engagement with the characters, a personal engagement with the situation, right? And to some degree, a kind of identification with what they're going through. So Adam and Eve are kind of hard to identify with because they're so kind of abstract. They're kind of like two universal figures of humanity. They're not really like individuals that you can get a feel for. But when we get to Job, the story of in the book of Job, it's very easy to kind of put yourself in his shoes and imagine what this situation would be like. Especially for those of you who are familiar with the story of Job, you know what I'm talking about. And then lastly, to become more careful readers, right? I talked about there's a difference between simply scanning the page and reading it, and really considering very carefully and slowly and even painstakingly what is actually being said. One of the things about reading and this course that I hope to kind of instill is that reading involves like using the muscle of your brain, for lack of a better word. And all of us are probably a little bit wimpy and out of shape. Just like if you threw yourself on the basketball court and you hadn't been going to the gym, like you'd be out of breath after a few minutes. Well, reading is really the same way. It involves a level of concentration. And of course, the more challenging the text, the more challenging the concentration. But it really involves kind of elevating your ability to focus, among other things, and to really pay attention to the details. All right, just a couple more things because I just want to wrap up here. Simple, kind of dumb, Captain Obvious question. What it really focus here is, what is literature? Well, the stupid simple answer is literature is what is taught in schools, right? I mean, it's defined by academics who are in control of departments who define, you know, what the curriculum is, quite simply. So in that sense, it's a little kind of tautological, but I'm going to give you a more satisfying definition as we go forward. One thing important about this class is that we're not just going to engage with the novel or with poetry or with myth and fiction. Literature means any type of form of writing. So philosophy, the novel, history, biography, poetry, drama, etc., etc. All of these types of writing are subject to being taught in a literature class, because literature really doesn't define the form of writing, right? If we had a class dealing with the modern novel, you wouldn't get an essay in philosophy, for example. It wouldn't be appropriate, except as maybe a secondary type of literature. What is literature? It's the entire body of writings of a specific language, period, or people, right? So you've got like German literature, English literature, 19th century American literature, Romantic period literature, Elizabethan literature, and so on and so forth, right? In a more serious sense, literature is almost kind of by definition, I think, great literature. It's texts which not only express the identity of a people, but make and shape them into who they are as a community, right? And this is specifically true of ancient literature. This role of literature has changed significantly in modern times up to a point, right? So look at what I'm saying here. The book does not just express the identity of a given people. It literally makes people into that identity. It makes them into that community. And this is something touched on in the Alan Bloom piece that we're not talking about. So the people of the book, does anyone know where that expression comes from or who it refers to and what book? The people of the book. Anybody?
Is it the Bible?
The book is the Bible, particularly the Old Testament. Who are the people?
The people who wrote them? What?
Not just
The
not
people
just-
that followed like they followed the religion. Are you talking about Old Testament, right?
Yeah, give me the names of those groups of people specifically. All right, the Jewish people. Good. Who else?
The Israelites. Was it?
Okay. So that's, yeah, the precursors of the modern day Jewish people, Jewish diaspora around the world. Who else?
Christians?
Christians. Is the Old Testament part of the book for Christians?
I just said the people that follow the religion.
Yeah, and I wanted the specific names.
Oh, Christianity. Okay.
Yeah, because we want to be specific here. Because if you just say that, people are like, well, who are you actually talking about? These are groups you know. The people of the book are Jews, Christians, and
Muslim.
yes. Why is that? What's Islam's relationship with the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament?
Is it Abraham?
What's their general relationship with the Old Testament? So you're getting into like genealogical issues. It's not unrelated. Who was Muhammad? What kind of person was he? I don't know. What was his profession?
Prophet Muhammad?
Yeah, he was a prophet. We'll talk about this more next class. What is a prophet? Moses was a prophet. What's a prophet?
As I think the person who believes in God and delivers this.
Yeah, way
belief
more than that,
logic?
because there are believers throughout history. There are literally billions of believers of these three religions today, but only very, very few of them are actually prophets.
Who deliver this faith to in other people?
Not quite there yet.
Are those who have like who can predict the future, who can say like this is gonna
You're getting close. You're getting close.
What are you talking
That's
about? What is a prophet?
that is a function that prophets often perform. Is
Don't-
they give auspices. You know, they give hints about what's going to happen in the future. But that's kind of hold on. That's kind of more what prophets do rather than specifically what they are. You're very close. Actually,
prophet-
Vicky
Prophet
said
talks about
it.
God, right?
Pardon?
I said prophet talks about the God.
I can talk about God too, but I'm not a prophet.
Did he spend time with God?
You're getting closer. You're
Tries to
getting
make
more.
understanding of God.
And what? Yeah, the prophet understands God, and then what do they do once they've
Teach.
understood God?
They teach. to try to-
Yes.
Spread
What's
a
the
message.
what's the classic story here of a prophet that you all have a reference point so to some degree on, greater or less? Moses goes up to the top of Mount Sinai and he's there. Is it like 4 days? I don't remember off the top of my head. What does he do there's like fire and brimstone and storms on the top of Mount Sinai, and he's all by himself. And the idea is that he's having like a kind of conference with God. He comes down from the mountain and then speaks to his people, and he literally speaks the word of God to the people. So the prophet is like a middleman or like a go-between or a mouthpiece for the gods on earth, or a God on earth, because sometimes there's gods, plural, and sometimes there's just God, capital G, right? The three monotheistic religions. So a prophet is one who reveals the word of God to the people and somehow has the ability to do this. And for thousands of years, it was understood that the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which is called the Torah or the Pentateuch, was literally written by Moses. And it wasn't until really the late 17th century where people started to openly question the notion that Moses had written the Bible. And why is there this connection between Moses as a prophet and Moses as the writer of the Bible, right? The connection is, what is the Bible? What does it represent? We can kind of get into some of this stuff today.
the beginning of time. Well, like
Yeah, that's true. That's the story that's told. I'm using the word represent. I don't mean like what stories are represented. What are the words in the Bible literally what are they for believers? What are those words in the Bible literally represent? Whose words are they?
God's word.
Yes. The idea of the Bible is not just this is a story about God and his people. It's that this story is literally manifest in God's words. Those are God's words. The idea was that Moses had written the first 5 books of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, and that, and why was he able to do that? Because he was a prophet. He had communed somehow with God and been inspired to have knowledge of those words that then he puts down on the page, right? Okay. So we got on the prophets, the people. All right. So the people of the book is expression. Actually, you find it very commonly in the Quran. Oh, so why are we talking about prophets? Because we were talking about Muhammad, right? Islam, as I understand it, and I'm not a scholar of Islam, so if I ever said something incorrect, you can correct me. But like Christianity, Islam takes the Old Testament as part of the foundation of their religion. And the Old Testament is the revealed word of God through a prophecy or through the prophet Moses, right? The only or the main qualification that Islam has is that they just say that Moses's prophecy is not the final one. There's a guy who came along in the early Middle Ages. His name is Muhammad. He was a prophet, and he also revealed the word of God, and he was the last one to do it. And his revelation of the word of God alters to some degree their understanding of the Old Testament based on his prophecy, and that therefore Islam is simply one that understands the Old Testament by means of the revelation of Muhammad, right? Okay, so the people of the book, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, very simple. The point is, when you read the book, you don't just find out what your identity is as a Jew or Christian or Muslim, right? And of course, they don't have all exactly the same books. The Hebrew Bible is the first 5 books and some additional writings. And then for Christians, you have the Old Testament, now no longer called the Hebrew Bible. It's now called the Old Testament because the Christians have a New Testament, a new statement, and that deals with the Gospels and the stories of Jesus, right? And he's their Messiah, because in the Old Testament, there was this prophecy that there would be a Messiah to kind of return things to a state, and that well, the difference, one of the basic difference between Jews and Christians is Christians recognize Jesus as the Messiah spoken of in the Old Testament, and Jews think he was a very intelligent and wise person, but just not a Messiah, right? An anointed one, which is what Messiah actually means. Okay, so these people don't just learn about who they are by reading these books. They become who they are by either reading these books or having these stories told to them or enacting rituals connected with the stories and the meanings of the stories, by which they are habituated to a certain identity as a group. And they're through their connection to these books and all the rituals and pomp and circumstance connected with them, the learning that comes with them in various contexts, you are literally shaped through this experience into a Jew, a Christian, and a Muslim, so on and so forth, right? And this is what makes these people the people of the book. And it's actually a really radical idea in human history when you have people coming in the ancient world who are now people of the book, because this was not the basic understanding in the ancient world of how a people was formed, right? What made a people a community, or what made a people a people, right? A community is a group of people bound by something in common, right? And something serious in common, like religion, like moral beliefs, like, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all human beings are created equal, stuff like that, right? not trivial stuff like, you know, I skateboard and you rollerblade or something like that. Right? In the ancient world, what made a people was their connection to the land, their participation in a communal way of life. And yes, religion has always been, I mean, religion and human civilization come into existence simultaneously, and they're deeply interconnected, right? But for example, in ancient Greece, there, while Homer and Hesiod, these two poets, operate something like the Bible, their works operate something like the Bible, the Greeks did not have like a reverential attitude toward their religious books. Religion for them primarily consisted of like certain rituals connected with priests and temples and the practices that were connected. And that's where like the site of religion happened for people in the ancient world generally. Whereas the Jews, Christians, and Muslims, their identity was something that could be bound up in a book and carried right across the planet, right, rather than tethered to a specific plot of land or a specific place. Okay, literature.
Professor.
Yes.
Pardon me for the
No,
interruption.
I'm talking too much. Please.
No, you're not. You're doing great. Professor, I came in like around 10 minutes late.
Oh, yeah. So there was one person who said they wanted to chat with me after. So Czar, if you could just hang on, and at the end of class, I'll make sure you just say mark me down, and I'll mark you right then and there.
Okay, no problem. Thank you, Professor.
And the other person who needed to chat, we can talk at the end. And I'm just confirming that. So literature, book learning, right? And this is a really interesting meaning of literature, that it involves book learning. First of all, literature is connected with the concept of literacy, right? What does it mean to be literate? This is a trick question. What does it mean to be literate?
To be able to read and write.
Yes. Today, in our, let me use the word, depraved modern times, literacy simply means the ability to read and write. And actually, it's pretty impressive because at this moment in human history, the percentage of people who can read and write is absolutely astronomical compared to most of human history, right? I don't have it's something I should look up now that I'm thinking about it. But I mean, if you were in ancient Egypt, probably like 1% of the population could read and write. And that was actually used as a strategy of control over all the other people, because when you keep people ignorant, you keep them enslaved, or at least in controlled in various ways, right? It's like a part of information warfare that, like, you know, stuff that still goes on today. So when we typically think of literacy, we think of just the ability to read and write. Is there any other meaning of literacy connected with that one, obviously? Okay, I'm going to say it. I think the full meaning of the word literacy is a literate human being is not someone who can just read and write, but someone who is conversant in the classic works of literature. Today, we call them great works of literature, right? From the period of the Renaissance up until about the middle of the 20th century, when university education really started to change in noticeable ways, particularly it got politicized, it got taken over by economic forces, and then education increasingly becomes like, you know, you educate people so you can increase the GDP of a country and grow the economy. And it's not about developing well-rounded liberal human beings as part of a liberal education. So literacy means like being conversant with the great works of literature, right? And, you know, these great works historically, not so much today, but historically, were understood as like, if you're an educated person, you have some greater or lesser degree of familiarity with these great works, because they're not just part of education in America in the 21st century. They are part of a repository of great achievements and great wisdom, and also just beauty and pleasure, that are the achievements of humanity in general, not any specific time and place. Okay, so one last meaning of literature, right? It's going back to comes as a Latinate word, and literatura, literally just writing, or literally the letter, right? You can see the connection there between the Latin and the English. Like, it's just letters, it's just words, right? Anything that's written, right? And in time, it came to have this kind of more a qualitative meaning to it. Okay, so just a couple more things, and then I'll be done with my sermon here. Okay, so then the question is, what is great literature? And you might even say that, depending on who you talk to, that's kind of redundant, right? So writings which express the permanent universal themes and ideas of the human experience. Those are some things we've talked about. Great literature consist of a core canon of books, which constitutes the total spectrum of the human experience and provides for a generally liberal education. I want to focus on two things there very quickly. This idea of a canon of books and a liberal education. This class, you're forced to take a class like this because there's still a notion lingering in the university that you should be compelled to receive a liberal education, regardless that you're going into business management or communications or, accounting or information systems or nursing or whatever it is, right? A canon, does anyone have any clue what a canon of books is? And it's got one N. The thing that fires is CANNON. What's a canon of books?
Is it like important pieces of work or like important pieces of literature?
Yeah, it is. Absolutely. Absolutely. But do you have any idea what a canon is specifically?
No, not as it refers to like books. I suppose like I don't have like specific book.
Okay, sure. Because we don't want to spend too much time on this. But a canon of books is just a kind of agreed upon body of books that institutions, historical consensus has decided are the kind of most important and most valuable books that are part of like the human heritage, right? We're speaking in really broad terms here. So the books were, I don't need to say to you guys, these are works of great literature. My opinion of these works is a sense meaningless, because there is historical consensus, even with all the political machinations of the day, that the things covered in this class or any other version of this class by another professor are part of the canon of books, which is almost like a library of great works that are the repository of the most important books, that have been written in human history. And the Bible is probably the quintessential example of a canonical book. Okay, liberal education. What the heck is a liberal education? Does anyone know?
Not anything specific. Like you're
Well,
getting.
go for it. You have anything you want to add? What do you want to say?
I was just saying, it's like because liberal is basically like free, so it's like
Very good. So there's a modern usage of the word liberal connected with our immediate politics. You got liberals and conservatives, and the usage of the word liberal in our political context like the food fight of politics, like CNN and Fox News and all that mumbo jumbo, they have a very different understanding of the word liberal. Now, it comes from the same source, but the word has evolved over time. But when we're talking about liberal education, we're not talking about the education that Joe Biden would want to give you. We're talking about a word that can be traced back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, and it has to do with something free, some kind of free education. Can you put a little finer point on it about what you mean by that?
I was saying like in
I'm sorry. I mean, liberal here is connected with the word liberty,
mhm.
right? It's a ancient Roman word, Latin word, freedom, right?
Mhm.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yes. And I was just like equating that that level of freeness with education, and how like it's nothing specific, a genuinely liberal. That's what I was trying to say.
Okay. So you're saying actually the content of liberal education, let's use this word instead of not specific. Let's say it's a broad type of education.
Yes, exactly.
I think that's what you mean. Any thoughts about what the free has to do with? Free what? How is liberty or freedom connected with the education itself?
Because isn't it usually people go to school for something that's not broad, something that
Yeah. I mean, so the original idea of a university, like an undergraduate education, right? What, traditionally the whole concept of graduate and PhD studies is that at the graduate level is where you specialize in that professional field, right? And that an undergraduate education would remain liberal, which in this sense we mean like broad or even generous, like someone who is liberal is generous. Liberality. So yeah. And any other thought? So Zara, that's very good. Any other thoughts about from anyone else about what a liberal education consists of? And why do we care about it? It's just some old artifact that's like a holdover from, I don't know, from the boomer generation or something. Do you guys talk about boomers? That's an internet thing these days. Anybody know what a boomer is?
I know baby boomers are.
Yeah. So it's derived from baby boomers, and it's like a derogatory epithet to talk about them for various reasons. Any other thoughts about what a liberal education is? We need the Jeopardy music. Your time out here. Okay, liberal education. First off, it's what Zara said. It's a broad education. And what is it based on? I mean, the core of it used to be reading, writing, and arithmetic, the 3 R's, something you all have probably heard in that vein at one time. And the concept of reading, writing, and arithmetic is based on like the basic types of understanding and intelligences or faculties of the human mind, right? We've got faculties that allow us to read, write, and to do mathematics, and that these form kind of the core intellectual capacities of the human being, right? And if you look at all the fancy disciplines today, you kind of see that those three in more subtle, sophisticated ways are still woven through everything, right? Number one. Number two, liberal education and the liberal arts stood in contradistinction to the manual arts. So liberal arts, by which I do not mean art class where you make paper mache, right? The liberal arts includes things like English and reading and literature and whatnot. So the liberal arts were the arts of the mind, and the manual arts were the arts of the what? What?
Hands?
Yes. Manual arts are manual labor, making things with your hands. I don't know, goldsmithing, ironsmithing, sculpture, brick, building buildings with bricks and things like that, right? So the whole concept of a liberal education was to cultivate your intellect as opposed to develop skills with making things with your hands. Liberal is also connected with the concept of freedom, and more specifically, a free human being, right? In the ancient world, you had masters and you had slaves. Actually, you still have slavery today. They just don't call it that, right? Because technically we're all against slavery and we have human rights and all this cool stuff. But unfortunately, we actually still have slavery all over the world. We have actually more slaves today on the planet than at any time in human history, partly because the population is so gigantic compared to what it once was. But we just don't call them slaves because we like to delude ourselves into thinking that we've advanced in the modern era. But if you go to China, if you go to North Korea, and off the top of my head, I don't want to name any other countries because I'm a little more dicey, but China and North Korea for sure. Do you know what North Korea does to its citizens? It sends them to other countries to work, but then the money that they have labored for and earned goes back to the government rather than the people who earned it, right? That's the very definition of a slave, where the fruits of your labors are taken from you and confiscated, and you get the pleasure of working without the reward. I think Lincoln said, what is it? The man who grows the wheat should get to eat the bread, or something like that. I'll have to look it up, but he's right. Anyway, so in the ancient world, you have masters and slaves. What did slaves do? They engaged in what were called the slavish arts. And what were the slavish arts? Very simply, manual labor. The free person was free in their body. Well, they were free politically in that they weren't a slave and they weren't treated under law like a slave. They were also free in the sense of being liberated from doing manual labor. So throughout human history until the 19th, well, even the 20th century, there is a bias against, an aristocratic bias against manual labor, right? This is for slaves. This is things we don't do, right? And what do? As free people, we use our minds. We use our intellect. That's the type of work that we do in the world rather than manual labor. And then the other element of freedom is a type of intellectual freedom, right? The liberal human being, the free human being, is someone who's not in the thrall of ignorance, in the thrall of living in the dark, without knowledge, without the ability to discern things. And by the same token, if you look at the history of slavery in any country, we're not talking just United States in the 1850s or 30s or something like that. We're talking about in the history of the planet. One of the fundamental strategies to keep slaves as slaves is to keep them ignorant, because the moment they get knowledge about the world, they start to understand their situation and want to liberate themselves from it. And they also have the information to do it, right? We all say knowledge is power, right? In many ways, that is true, especially for the slave. And that explains why they weren't given the knowledge, because they didn't want them to have the power. If you ever read the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, he talks about this in great detail when he was being taught to read by the slave master's wife. And then the slave master said, "What are you doing teaching him how to read? He is going to get ideas if you let him read." And he was cut off from being taught. And then he had to teach himself, which is quite a heroic story. And actually his liberation from slavery was not just an act of courage physically, but it was an intellectual act. And part of it, a big part of it, involved his reading. And then once he could read, he started reading a lot of different things to understand what it really meant to be a slave, because he didn't really understand that at first. Okay, so enough of that. Yeah, I like this line a little bit. So what are great books? They're works of quality, and quality is a matter of fact rather than opinion. I think it's the case that, you know, there are certain great books that you're going to like, and there are other books you're not going to like as much, but that they're written with care, that they have a deep kind of wisdom and things of that nature. I think I would argue that that's kind of, it's there, it's objective. Even when you disagree with, it's not about, remember what Bloom said, it's not about agreeing or disagreeing with the book. It's about confronting the book and getting sustenance from it for food for thought, right? If you would disagree with it, that could be just as valuable as if you agree with it. And then, you know, does anyone know who Count Basie is?
Is it a female?
No.
Catherine? Oh, okay. Never mind.
He was a famous big band leader from the 1930s. What did they do? Bebop, jazz? I'm not even sure, to be honest, exactly the kind of music. It's always called big band music. It's an African-American musician, an incredibly famous musician, incredibly talented musician. And he said, there's good music and there's everything else. What is the everything else? He doesn't actually say it outright, right? You have to infer it, but it's not that hard to infer. What's the everything else?
Not so good music.
Thank you. There's good music and there's lots of shit, right? Come on, let's be real here. And this dovetails very nicely with what Harold Bloom said. We're reading against the clock, and we're reading against the clock for that ultimate change, which is death, right? Which means books take a while to read. Your life has limited time. Your life is finite. So you shouldn't read everything else. You should read the good stuff, right? You know, our cultures, so-called, our popular culture, right? Like, I don't know, all that stuff you see on the TV and the internet, most of it is like Doritos for your brain, right? And Doritos for your brain are about as good for you as Doritos are for your body, right? It's not so good for you, right? I don't know. People end up, Doritos and soda, let's say, you end up getting, you get overweight and unhealthy, and you get diabetes and all kinds of stuff, right? You know, there's a lot of, we have probably the best popular culture of, you know, I don't want to get too grandiose here, but I mean, we have a lot of cool stuff in popular culture. Don't get me wrong. And I'm not prejudiced against like pop culture, because there's a lot of cool stuff I discover on the internet that's like kind of from younger generations that I think is really pretty funny and cool. And like the meme, whoever invented the meme should be like in the Hall of Fame of humanity, right? I think the meme is like one of the most amazing things, because they're so clever, and they're really funny when they're good. But there's a lot of shit out there, and you know, you only have one life, and you know, everybody gets obsessed about eating right, but people don't always think so much about what they're putting in their brain, the food that they feed their brain. So it's really vital. Okay, so one last thing, great literature. We talked about the accumulated wisdom of the ages, right? When we think of the Bible is really not one book. It's many books put together that were written over about 1,000 years, give or take, right? So these were stories that were cobbled together over long periods of time and represent the accumulated experience and therefore the accumulated wisdom of people in the ancient world. And they understood a lot. Like we moderns think we're brilliant and all that stuff, but the famous expression that Jonathan Swift an Irish writer from the 17th century. He said, we are like dwarves standing on the shoulders of giants, right? And the giants were the people in the ancient world, and us moderns, us modern people, were the dwarves. We stood higher than the people in the ancient world, but only because we were on their shoulders, right? And it's a really brilliant metaphor or analogy to understand our situation. Thucydides, really credited with being the first modern historian from ancient Greece. He wrote a book called the Peloponnesian War, and he said this book was a possession for all time. And what was he saying? That his depiction of the war between Athens and Sparta was not just for the Greeks. And it really wasn't even just about the Greeks, despite the fact that the Greeks were the participants in the war. He acknowledges in his book that he's determined to, through this depiction of this war, to illustrate human nature and what it is capable of and what it is like under particular circumstances. One of the most dramatic circumstances being war, brings out things in human beings that, you know, in peace times don't come out. So he called it a possession for all time. It's not just, it's a book made by a Greek or written by a Greek, but it's not necessarily about the Greeks exclusively. It's not necessarily for the Greeks. It's not necessarily for Westerners or white people. It's for everybody, right? Ben Jonson, who was a contemporary of Shakespeare, he said Shakespeare was not of an age, but for all time. I've gone like way longer on this than I should have, but that's okay. When we think of movies, when we think of books, we think of them in terms of like generationally, or we think of them in terms of the decade, right? And they get connected with a specific time period, right? And that's a reasonable way to think about, and there's reasons why it's justified thinking of cultural artifacts in relationship to their specific time, right? But we tend to only think in those terms as kind of modern 21st century Americans. Johnson says Shakespeare is not of an age, but for all time. And I think he really means that. He's aware that Shakespeare speaks to things going on during the period of Elizabethan England, early 17th century England. But it's not just about 17th century. It's not just about the English. It's not just about white Europeans. It's about human beings, right? And yes, it's his perspective, and there are others' perspectives to be had on human beings besides Shakespeare. Okay, so here's a great quote about, you know, why do the meanings of these things endure, right? These stories, right? These narrative accounts, right? And so if we think of, I said at the beginning here that these fictions, these myths are designed to get at the truth. And you say, well, how is that? Because a fiction by definition is not literally true. And if we want to talk about types of writing that are nonfiction that get at the truth, we think of, for example, history. It's just one example. We could also think of biography. We could think of philosophy, science, to the extent that it comes in written form, is trying to get at the truth. So here's how we can think about the truth relative to fiction. The author here says, history is the story of things that only happen once, right? So Columbus crossed the ocean blue, and it was a specific event that occurred one time in 1492, right? And that's it. And that's the truth of it. But he says, great literature tells us the story of things that happen all the time, forming part of the human condition. Okay, so let me clarify this a little bit. Myth, fiction, literature, it doesn't describe what literally happened, but it describes things that can and do happen all the time, right? So, you know, the character in Girl, we don't know how true to life that story really is. Maybe it's not literally true, but it depicts a situation with a girl and her mother that is certainly consistent with either dynamics between generations, dynamics between mothers and daughters, or more specifically, conflicts between mother and daughters if coming from a certain culture, right? That everybody in that culture, even if this wasn't literally true, they'd be able to relate to it and understand the general truth of what's being stated. So they're general truths rather than specific truths, like Columbus crossing the ocean blue. Okay, one last thing here. In terms of, I'm asserting that a kind of universality of literature. And I just want to give you this lovely example of a man who, well, today may have a very different opinion on some of these authors, but W.E.B. Du Bois is a famous Black civil rights leader, professor, intellectual. He was also kind of sympathetic with the socialists, and here he's meeting Mao Zedong and took a trip to the Soviet Union a year prior, right? He wrote a book called The Souls of Black Folk, among many other books, and that's his most famous. And it's a very powerful and sophisticated book in terms of understanding the experience of Black Americans or Blacks in the United States, or African Americans in the United States, and their problem of assimilation as Americans, given the separation, starting with their skin color and the way they're treated in light of their skin color. Anyway, at a certain point in his life, he actually rejected living in the United States and moved to Ghana in 1963, became a citizen of Ghana, right? And this was the result of his whole kind of intellectual framework of understanding his own identity in relationship to the kind of box that Blacks were put in America in terms of their identity. And it's an act of repudiation. So he's, an intelligent, but also a kind of rebellious man. He rejected the United States. It's very intriguing they did that. However, we should keep in mind that in his most famous book, The Souls of Black Folk, he makes an incredibly poignant description of something that we see in Machiavelli's letter and also in Quelbeck's submission, where the author talks about having a relationship with the author of the books or the character in the books that he's reading, right? And when Du Bois opens up a book, he doesn't see a white person. He doesn't see a male. He doesn't see a heterosexual. He doesn't see a master or a slave. He sees another human being. He says, I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. Across the color line, I move my arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, two famous French authors, where smiling men and welcome women glide in gilded halls. From out of the caves of the evening that swing between the strong-limbed earth and the tracery of the stars, I summon Aristotle, Greek philosopher, and Aurelius, that's Marcus Aurelius, the kind of, what was he? He was emperor of Rome, of the Roman Empire, and he was also an author, and is kind of a philosopher emperor. And they come all graciously with no scorn nor condescension. He's saying they come with no scorn or condescension to me, a Black man, right? So wed with the truth, I dwell above the veil, right? And what does he say he finds in these authors? He finds equals who will speak to him not as simply a Black person, but as a human being, right? And I find this very intriguing from a guy who was so, bold about his understanding of the United States of America, that he would also say this, that these books allowed him to transcend some of those things, the very same things that he encountered in American culture in the 1930s, right? A time where there was still Jim Crow and all kinds of, strong, racial problems and so on. Okay, so we've got 13 minutes left. let's do some fun reading here with oh, come on, you silly thing. Oh. One second. Mm. One moment here. I'm sorry. Oh, come on. Okay, here we go. Okay, we'll start right here. Get this out of the way. Come on, please. Just do what I want you to do. All righty. So that there's something really interesting that Tim Parks say here. I just paraphrase it and then I'm going to ask someone to read. We might say, just like the Bible, you look at this passage right here. In the beginning, writing was sacred, right? Notice that. Then he says, in the beginning was the word. He's making reference. The Bible was a sacred text. The words of the Bible were literally understood as the words of God. Therefore, the book had to be treated worshipfully and absolutely respectfully. Does Tim Parks want us to treat all books with this type of reverence and respect? Like every writing is sacred and holy?
I don't know about respect, but he did tell us to be critical about it.
Yeah. So what is he at? What do you think in this? And does he want us to treat the text as sacred? Are believers allowed to be openly critical of the Bible? I mean, certainly they can be. Are they supposed to be? Does Tim Parks want us to treat what we read with this kind of reverence and respect?
Yeah, I believe so.
I mean, he does want us to be careful readers, and in that sense, we're going to respect what's said. But what kind of attitude is he trying to? It's a little different than Harold Bloom. What kind of attitude is he trying to cultivate? Does he give us permission to criticize the author?
Yes.
Does he give us to criticize? Does he give us permission to say, I don't buy that BS?
Yes.
Absolutely. He's got one passage on here where, like, I think he writes in the margin, like, I think this is basically like a bunch of BS, right? And why is that? Right? Yeah. So it's a conversation, but he wants to give us permission. So he's dealing with students who come in, they, oh my God, we're reading great works of literature. This is like the holy book in our hands. We have to respect it. And I mean, yes, you do have to respect it in terms of wanting to reach out to understand what that author is saying, right? You are doing yourself a disservice to disrespect the author in the sense of not being open to what they're trying to say. But that certainly doesn't mean you have to agree with them. And also, when you understood what they've said, if you think that what they've said is a bunch of baloney, then it may be appropriate to say it's a bunch of baloney, right? And I mean, I think what he's doing here is like, relax a little bit, have your own opinion, and be free to give your own opinion. It's really, really crucial. Okay, so there's another thing he wants to address here, which has a little less to do with you forming your own opinions of the text through marginal notation and highlighting and things like that. But he says, my students, they read a passage and they recite the words and they don't really even know what's being said because they're not paying attention, right? There are many different reasons why you might not understand a passage. The language could be challenging. The experience being described could be foreign to you because of your age, your culture, your religion, any number of things, right? Maybe you just haven't experienced that thing. But sometimes we miss what's being said because we're not paying proper attention. Could someone read these two paragraphs here for us? And we'll call it a night, right? This is a good ending. This is where we're going to end. It's just the way it's going to be. Who could read for us, please, and get some brownie points for participation?
I can read, I guess.
Angelica.
All right. So
Awesome. You're recruited.
Cool. Okay. It says, but beyond these small technicalities, the kind of internal inconsistencies that someone like Beckett introduced into his work to wake the reader up. And again, many students do not notice such deliberate inconsistencies. I would find that we had read a page of Virginia Woolf together without students realizing that we were being encouraged to think positively about suicide, or we would read Lawrence without their being aware that the writer was insisting that some lives were definitely worth more than others.
Okay, so let's pause for a second. Here he gives three interesting instances. Number one, Samuel Beckett gives intentional contradictions in his text. First of all, you typically would never think that an author would intentionally contradict themselves in a text, right? Because that's logically inconsistent. Why would they do that? Well, maybe they have rationales for doing it to get you to awaken to the fact that you're being told one thing here and something different there. And you actually have to realize that that's being done. And since you assume the internal consistency of the text, you don't pay attention to it. Then the next thing, Virginia Woolf speaking positively about suicide. Now, I have nothing positive to say about suicide, but Virginia Woolf is free to speak her own mind, right? So what is our value system? I would think that the average person would not be inclined, and actually there would be a kind of like a taboo against thinking positively about suicide. So why do the students miss the fact that Virginia Woolf is actually speaking positively about suicide? It's because they're not expecting it, because there's a taboo against it, and because they're not expecting, because there's a taboo, they're not expecting them to say it. And then we get to Lawrence, British writer, and what does he say? He asserts that some lives have more worth than other. And what does he mean there? Like some ways of life, some ways of being human being have more value and therefore should be more esteemed than other ways of life, right? And of course, we live in a very egalitarian society in which we are very relativistic, and we assume that since everybody's entitled to their own opinion, that all opinions are equally good, and including opinions of how to live, right? So why do the students not see these things? Because they're not looking for them and expecting them, particularly because they may contradict some of your basic kind of, ingrained ways of looking at the world. You don't expect the author to be looking at the world in this way. I'm sorry, Angelica, continue.
Okay. I even remember a class reading this passage from Henry Green, admittedly as part of a larger scene, without any student being aware of its sexual content.
Okay, you heard, he's already given away the story here. But for $1,000, you have to tell me what's being described in this paragraph. So this paragraph here that's in the orange is a quotation from a novel by Henry Green. So this is not Tim Park's statement. This is quotations from Henry Green's text. So you want to read it?
But in spite of Mrs. Middleton's appeal, the girl with a "here you are" leant over to the husband and opened wide the pearly gates. Her wet teeth were long and sharp, of an almost transparent whiteness. The tongue was pointed also and lay curled to a red tip against her lower jaw, to which the gums were sterile pink, way back behind, carbonous, and a deeper red. Her uvula, is that the word?
Uvula.
Uvula seemed to shrink from him.
Okay. What is being we got a couple minutes here. What is being described in this paragraph? And please be specific.
It's like I'm trying to find the most correct way of putting it. Like they're having sex, right? Oral sex.
It could be.
I mean, the way it's described, like, I feel like it's oral sex.
Okay. So I think it's one. Well, let's come back to the oral sex thing in a minute. What does the author, Henry Green, spend most of his time describing, and what does he spend most of his time not describing?
He's not describing the actual, I guess, action, but he is
Thank you.
describing everything around,
Awesome. So he's not describing the specific actions that are being undertaken. He's describing this woman's mouth, right? The tongue pointed this way, curled to a red tip against her lower jaw. The gums. I mean, this is like a novel written by a dentist, right? So if this is a romantic scene with some type of sexual content, the sexual content is not described directly. And there's fancy words for this, like defamiliarization, where you describe something that you would otherwise be familiar with, but you describe it in a way where it's from a very different perspective than you would typically kind of conceive of it, right? So Green spends all this time describing her mouth, right? Which in one sense is totally irrelevant to really understanding the action that's going on. Like, what is she actually doing? And it actually distracts us from what she's actually doing. And if you weren't told that there was sexual content in this passage, like his students, like he's claiming about his students, you might very well miss that that's actually what's being described, right? This is really important for things we're going to read, particularly in the ancient world, which is that in the ancient world, they insinuate and they suggest and they use figurations, they use symbols, they use metaphors. They don't always come out and say things directly. part of our modern ethos of reading and also of writing is to be as direct and as clear as possible and state things in unequivocal terms. There's no mystery. Think about like how you're supposed to write an email to like a coworker or your boss. Your goal is to transmit information as clearly and succinctly as possible, right? No ambiguities, right? No wasted time. Writing coming out of the ancient world, and it still has a lot of these features today, but the goal is to be roundabout. The goal is to be indirect. The goal is to suggest what's going on without hitting you over the head, right? Think about how this would be just Cardi B. Does everybody know Cardi B?
Yes.
Yes.
Who doesn't, right? She's my hero, my musical hero. Imagine if Cardi B took the same content here, the sexual content, and she rewrote it the way Cardi B would write it. Can everybody imagine what she'd be saying?
It would be very explicit. She's
It
very
would be brutally, blatantly pornographic, explicit, whack you over the head type stuff, right? Just one couple. What is a uvula? I mean, first of all, if you want to use a word that turns people off, like erotically, like doesn't uvula is a great word. I mean, maybe this gets dentists excited, but it certainly doesn't get your average human being, aroused. Does anyone know what the uvula is?
Is it that thing that's dangling in the back of your throat?
Yeah, like when cartoon characters scream, you see the thing dangling, right? Okay, just 1 second here and we'll call it a night. So you get these long, sharp teeth. I mean, she's like a shark or something. And she opens her pearly gates. What are the pearly gates?
Her mouth.
Yeah, her teeth and basically her mouth. Your teeth are your pearly whites, and the pearly gates are not the ones in heaven, because he's making a kind of funny play on the pearly gates in heaven. He's talking about her teeth. Let's just finish with this. Do we know for sure that this is oral sex?
no, not for sure. You can only infer, like you can assume by what he said, but
Well, I think there's two alternatives to what's being described here in terms of the actions. I think one is oral sex. And the more I read it, I think that's plausible. I'm not sold on that completely, but I think it's plausible. What's the other alternative? The more straightforward alternative. Mrs. Middleton's appeal, the girl with the here you are look, we could talk about what that is, but we don't have time. Leant over to her husband and opened wide the pearly gates. And then the rest of it is just a description of her mouth. It says leaned over to her husband, or leant over to her husband, leant over. If it's not oral sex, it's what?
She's at a dentist's office.
No, definitely not. That's her husband. She's doing this to her husband. So in terms of the action described, we only get the lean over to her husband. What may she be doing? This is a little more pedestrian than the oral sex. A little more first, I don't know, second base or something.
Just a kiss?
Yeah, it could just be a really, I don't want to, I'm not sure what word I should use to describe what kind of kiss it is, but it's like a really, it's a kiss, an enthusiastic one, right? And when you look at it, it says her uvula seemed to shrink from him. And you get the impression that he is looking in her mouth and seeing her uvula as she's about to kiss him. So that her head is like up by his head and not somewhere else. So that's my exegetical argument for what actually is happening as a kiss, but we can, we don't know for sure, given what we've been given here. Okay. Let's just ask this and call it a night. Does this sound very romantic?
No.
No.
No, not at all. Right. And so it's interesting, by the author focusing on this scene in a certain way, he's concealed the sexual content, but also taken away the typical emotions. You would, I mean, when you think of people kissing in a story, a husband and a wife, my goodness, you want all those warm and fuzzy feelings and connection and intimacy and all that. And you're getting this odd description of, you know what our teeth remind me of here? Everybody know the scene in Aliens where like the alien opens its mouth and the teeth come out and everything?
Yeah.
Maybe. Well, one person, good. That's what I think of with this scene. I think the mouth like comes out toward the Sigourney Weaver character, something like that. And it's very terrifying and gross. Okay. All righty. So we will call it a night right here. Thank you for holding on. And the two people who needed to chat briefly, I can touch base with you now. But otherwise, have a great night, and I will see you next Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor. Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Have a
Good
great night. Thank you very much.
You too.
Hi,
Zar.
I'm one of them. Oh, sorry.
Okay. So Zar, I've got you down for attendance.
Thank
Good
you,
night,
Professor.
Vicky.
Have a good night.
Yep. And let me just let me turn off recording.